Mr President, I rise today to speak in support of the honourable member's motion. Members will be familiar with this document right here. It is the government's budget, and it set a target for the 2024-2025 financial year to introduce changes to the Children and Young People Safety Act. But, Mr President, the 2023-24 budget set a very similar target to the target that is outlined in this budget. It too had a target to introduce amendments to support changes to the Children and Young People Safety Act. I feel as if this is déjà vu. But of course, we also know that this target first originated, and this body of work first originated in Labor's 2022-23 budget, where the commencement of the full legislative review for this Act first began. Following the review of this Act for this minister, the report has now sat with the minister collecting dust since February 2023. And despite this featuring as a target in all three of the Labor government's budgets to date, and the commitment from this government to introduce changes to the legislation last year, it took the opposition, it took the crossbench, and it took members of the community to rally in discontent with the performance of this minister to produce draft legislation. On the last Wednesday of sitting before the midwinter break, Mr President, this chamber passed a motion calling on the Malinauskas Labor government to introduce legislation to amend the Children and Young People Safety Act to prioritise children and what is in their best interests in South Australia. A motion that was in the name of the Honourable Tammy Franks that the government did not support, claiming, and I quote, that due to the notice period given for moving and bringing this motion to a vote, the Labor caucus has been unable to consider the motion. Thus, the government is not able to support it on that basis. Well, Mr President, this motion had been sitting on the notice paper since the end of 2023. An absolutely pitiful excuse on behalf of the government to not come to the table on a motion on an issue as crucial as legislative reform for child protection. Mr President, if we fast forward to estimates for the Department for Child Protection, and in case members of this place need to jog their memory as to which day this was the day that the Minister for Child Protection was seen squealing in this chamber, as if to squeal with glee. But Mr President, the minister was not able to give a definitive timeline on that day as to when this legislative reform would be brought to the parliament. The Honourable Tammy Franks, the Honourable Connie Benares, the Honourable Sarah Gaiman, the opposition, all stood together following this call, calling for the minister's resignation. We each gave notice of the same censure motion on the last sitting day before the midwinter break. I think it is safe to say that the Minister for Child Protection was on notice that her performance was lacking. So I find it interesting that despite this having been a target for the minister in her 2022, 2023, 2024 budgets, that suddenly, magically, we see a draft bill put out for consultation when the minister is staring at a censure motion upon the return of Parliament. The minister has had more than 2 years to introduce this reform, and only now, under immense pressure from the opposition, from the crossbench, from members of the community, is she addressing her failed targets. It should not have taken this. It should not have taken pressure from the opposition, from the crossbench, from the community to get involved for this minister to bring such crucial legislative reform. The minister has had no issue in taking her time to get this legislation out for consultation. Yet when facing a censure motion, she's been able to pull a rabbit out of the hat, yet she's only giving the community 1 month to consider Labor's proposed changes. She's been sitting on the review of this Act for roughly around 18 months, since February of 2023, yet the community gets 1 month to consider legislative reform that will bring upon it such significant change to the child protection system. Whilst the Minister has released a draft bill for consultation, the community, of course, is still left waiting for the legislation to be brought to this Parliament. Katrine Hilliard cannot afford to wait to bring this legislation to the Parliament any longer, and so the opposition will be watching with great interest to hold this Minister and this government to account to ensure that upon the finalisation of the consultation period, that this legislation is promptly brought to the Parliament. It is crucial that the government gets this legislation right and that long-awaited legislative reform is brought to tackle this in-crisis child protection system. But of course, Mr President, we know that this is not the only target that the Minister has failed to deliver from her budget last year. The Minister has been able to pull a rabbit out of the hat following criticism from the opposition. Over the midwinter break, we saw the Minister launch the Child Protection and Family Support Sector Workforce Strategy and release the refreshed Statement of Commitment for foster and kinship carers for consultation. But Mr President, considering the 2022-23 budget included a target to begin work on a workforce development strategy, the 23-24 budget set the target to develop a sector-wide child protection workforce strategy. And then, of course, we saw a target in this year's budget to finalise and implement the child protection and family sector workforce strategy. But one has to wonder what has taken this Minister and her department so long to develop and implement a workforce strategy. The 23-24 budget provided a target to launch a refreshed Statement of Commitment to foster and kinship carers. And we know our carers are absolutely crucial. But only this week, Mr President, did the Statement of Commitment that appears on the Department for Child Protection's website still have the name and signature of the former Minister for Child Protection, Rachel Sanderson, and the former Chief Executive, Cathy Taylor's signatures and names at the bottom of that Statement of Commitment. When you compare the draft Statement of Commitment that's currently been released for consultation with the existing Statement of Commitment on the DCP website, one has to wonder what has taken so long for this Minister to release this document, particularly in circumstances where the proposed amendments are modest and do not justify the failure to meet her target and should not have taken around 2.5 years since this government has been elected. Whilst the Minister has turned her attention to these failed targets, it is the opposition's view that it is too little, too late. The opposition has now been calling for a standalone child protection minister for over 2 years. As my colleague in the lower house, Josh Teague, has said, her portfolios of sport, recreation and racing mix with child protection like oil and water. Whilst this initially was due to our belief that this portfolio requires laser-like focus, rather than someone who is juggling their time with the crucial child protection portfolio and a child protection system that is in crisis, with attending sporting matches, we now call for the Minister's resignation due to her clear failure to deliver in this space. Mr President, I have met with many people who are involved in this space, stakeholders, organisations, carers, families, and it is absolutely heartbreaking to hear what is going on and the lack of support that they have told me that they are provided with. Earlier this week, we saw a report about one of the South Australian parliamentary inquiries being inundated by stories of foster carers who were struggling to cover costs for vulnerable kids. And Mr President, I'll share some of this article. It says that foster carers are having to survive on afterpay as they struggle to cover the everyday costs of taking in children in state care. In one case, a single carer has racked up a $2,000 bill on the high-interest buy now, pay later scheme, and another is using it to afford groceries. It goes on to say that many have warned it is becoming unaffordable to be a foster carer as the cost of living eats into government payments. The article goes on to say that a carer has said we survive on afterpay, and another carer referring to the payment system which allows users to pay for goods in instalments. One carer of more than 20 years said they live week to week and use afterpay to buy food on the weeks when they don't receive government payment. Why is this the case? This is utterly unacceptable. I hear time and time again about the need for greater support from this government, about the struggle many carers face to pay for basic utilities and bills. I believe carers are doing their best. We would be absolutely lost without them. So it is on this government to make sure that they fix this problem, that they find solutions, and that they deliver support for carers. There are a long list of issues with the child protection system at the moment, Mr. President. The minister's failure to meet targets suggests that she is struggling to juggle her time and focus between child protection and her sports portfolio. Over the midwinter break, the opposition circulated a petition that is calling for a standalone child protection minister. The petition has gained nearly 3,700 signatures, many people sharing their thoughts on the in-crisis child protection system, and I thank those who have joined in this call and who have shared their views. I know many in the child protection system, particularly our carers, it takes a lot of bravery to be able to come forward and to share your thoughts on how our system can be better improved. But to share a few comments that have been passed on with the chamber, Mr. President, one person says, and I quote, "The state of this system is diabolical. This minister has failed in her basic duties and has demonstrably failed to take her role seriously. This Premier must prioritise child welfare over sport and recreation, and failure to do so is nothing short of professional negligence," end quote. Another person said, quote, "I cannot believe that child protection is just lumped in with sport and recreation. That simply devalues the importance of children in care. There can be no more important issue than the well-being of children. We need a standalone minister," end quote. Another person says, quote, "It's time for Minister Hilliard to step aside and allow someone else to become a standalone Minister for Child Protection, someone who will dedicate their political career to the most vulnerable children in our state," end quote. Another person, "Mr. Premier, it's time that South Australia had a standalone child protection minister. The portfolio is way too important for it to be a shared ministry." Another person says South Australia desperately needs a standalone child protection minister to directly address children in crisis situations. Standalone child protection minister should also address the lack of child protection workers. Another says, "Please, for the sake of children, families, carers and the broken system, appoint a standalone minister for the child protection portfolio." Another, "It is appalling that the Minister for Child Protection does not have a standalone portfolio. Please rectify this immediately." Another says, "There needs to be change, so let's start with having a standalone child protection minister, someone whose actions change and listens to what is needed." Mr. President, I think that you get the point. The community is absolutely behind the calls for a standalone child protection minister, as evidenced behind by many people joining in our calls through our petition. The opposition's petition calling for a standalone child protection minister shows that many in South Australia's community believe that it is untenable for Minister Katrine Hilliard to continue to juggle her sports portfolio with her child protection portfolios. So Minister Katrine Hilliard at this point must do the right thing, and she must resign and step aside and allow someone else to come in and to take over and to have a singular dedicated focus on the in-crisis child protection system. We need a child protection minister who is completely focused on our state's most vulnerable children and not someone who is preoccupied with sports. Katrine Hilliard's lack of urgency in delivering this crucial legislative reform is just another reason why South Australians deserve a standalone child protection minister. We need someone whose sole focus is protecting our most vulnerable. Crisis set a test of leadership, Mr. President, and with the child protection system in crisis, the Premier must prioritise this portfolio and he must appoint a standalone dedicated child protection minister. We need a show of leadership from the Premier. The ball is squarely in his court.